As a music fanatic, finding Rei Harakami's work is like unlocking something in the brain, especially as a Western listener without the knowledge of the environment in which his musical style was formed. If you're like me and found his music in a bout of luck through the more often than not useless Spotify Explore tool, it's likely that you are into IDM at least on a general level, but might lack the knowledge of the specific influences Japanese IDM underwent to become what it is now. I'm using the term IDM loosely here, seeing as a lot more genres are present in the Japanese electro scene. From house to ambient, it's all represented richly within the community. In this video essay, I will look at the different components of Harakami's life and career that helped shape his music. Also, excuse me if I talk a little bit awkward, English is not my first language, and this is the first video essay I've ever done. I'm just very interested in this topic and feel like a lot more people should know about Rei Harakami, so yeah. I will start by giving a little bit of context and personal information about Harakami. He was born on the 10th of December 1970 in Hiroshima City, Japan. However, he moved to Kyoto during his college years, where he studied at the Kyoto College of Arts during the early 1990s. During this time, he was academically focusing mostly on film and, according to Steve Huey, initially wanted to pursue a career writing scores. At this time, Harakami only played the guitar and bass guitar, rather than making electronic music. In fact, an interview with fellow alumni and friend Yasuto Yuda reveals that Harakami had a rather strong distaste for computer music at first. I used a computer and he made more analog music using cassettes. He said that he didn't like computers. If anything, he was more into improvisation, so he wasn't really interested in playing and performing using a computer, which is more fixed. As evident from years past, however, it's clear that Harakami formed a connection with the medium after all, and continued making electronic music until his tragic death on July 27th of 2011, due to a cerebral hemorrhage making him 40 years old. Although Harakami's time was a bit before that of social media, there is enough of his personality shown online through blogs and quotes from friends that form a picture of the sort of person he was besides his artist image. Yasuto Yuda, for example, describes his memories of Harakami when they first met in university. My impression of him was that he was a really cheeky guy. He spoke what was on his mind, so he was quick to express any complaints. But it wasn't like he just didn't want to work. He just wasn't afraid to speak up when something was wrong or the work could be made more efficient. I think that never changed, even in his later years, but back then he was about 20 years old, so I thought he was cheeky. A few quotes of advice from Harakami himself also quite express his personality, in my opinion. In 2008, at the Rising Sun Rock Festival, when asked about habits, he answered about recycling and reducing plastic bottles, as well as saying, "Also, I'm a smoker, but I always carry a portable ashtray with me," showing his care for the environment. Another time in 2006, when asked for a message to his fans, he said, "Take care of your health, drink less alcohol, be careful not to drop your wallet." Personally, I feel like the cheeky side of Rei Harakami that Yasuto Yuda recognized in university still shone through later in his life in small remarks like this. So how did Harakami, whose passion lay with film and acoustic, or at least non-electronic film score music, end up one of Japan's most interesting figures in ambient and electro music? The interview with Yasuto Yuda is an important source in understanding this evolution, as he explains how he personally played a role in widening Harakami's perspective on electronic music. When he saw my Roland MC500 sequencer and other gear I was using at the time, He asked half-jokingly, "What do you do with this?" So I showed him how to use it. I wasn't necessarily the reason he got into it, but I think maybe he was able to experience something he hated and feel an affinity for it. Or he realized that it was interesting depending on how you used it. This clearly did leave a lasting impression on Harakami, seeing as he would later stick to Roland Corporation software and famously used exclusively the Roland SC88 Pro for his fourth album Lust, which he had been primarily using anyway since its release in 1996. Before this change though, Harakami was by and large a filmmaker. During his early days of film school, he mainly made animations and later moved on to making experimental works that reimagined the structure of traditional film. His unconventional techniques went further than purely narrative, as Yuda remembers. He used to make flyers for exhibitions and such using the convenience store copy machines, but he didn't use it in the traditional way. Instead, he'd use the copy machine as an effect. He'd go through the trouble of making an illustration small and enlarging it on the copy machine to make the quality rough on purpose. He seemed to like things like that, figuring out how to use existing technology to alter something. He did that with sound and film too. I think in hindsight, this makes it easier to see how he ended up making a switch to electronic music later, as it mimics this tendency of using modern technology but with a hint of unconventionality. Even as his equipment grew older and more outdated, it still amazes people today what he could accomplish with it. This is just one sign of many that indicates how inventive Harakami really was. The switch from film to music began gradually with making film music for his own projects, but also those of others. Back then, he was making music for people's films. Most of the songs on Semi Sekai are from that, remembers Yura. Semi Sekai and Hiroi Sekai are two compilation albums released only in 2021, but the songs date back to even long before Harakami switched to electronic music, being recorded roughly around 1991 to 1993. Before making this cassette, he hated computer and techno music, but he suddenly became absorbed in it, Yura states. He defines these two albums as being a divider between the pre-electro filmmaker Rei Harakami and the electronic musician Rei Harakami, saying Hiroi Sekai was his world before that, and his world after that was Semi Sekai. After Semi Sekai came out, he started receiving work requests from all kinds of people. From there, music started to become his job. But back then, he still felt strongly about wanting to be a filmmaker, so he was really torn. About Harakami's last film project titled Voyant in 1995, Yura had this to say. I think he wanted closure with filmmaking, so he created Voyant to bring a conclusion to his filmmaking career.
見えてる?
見えてない。と言った次の瞬間には、ここで見えているものはすでにさっきとは違うものが見えていた。と言った次の瞬間には、ここで見えているものはすでにさっきとは違うものが見えていた。と言った次の瞬間には、ここで見えているものはすでにさっきとは違うものが見えていた。結局これは、誰が誰に対して何をどう伝えようとしているのかっていうことを、この僕自身が分かっていないということに他ならない。なんて嘘だけど、でも、例えば、人が何らかのイメージを想定して何かを作ったりしても、それは結局、人が何らかのイメージを想定して何かを作ったことにしかならないんじゃないのかって。そういうことを、今僕は誰に対して喋ってるのかさえも、実際わからなくなってるんだ。
ここは四角い世界。
え?ここが四角い世界?
そう。
Now that I have gone in depth on how Harakami came to be a full musician, I think it's important to create an outline of his career, starting with the two albums mentioned before, Hiroi Sekai and Semi Sekai. These did not come out until 10 years after Harakami's death, but form an essential part of his evolution as an artist. They most likely formed the foundation of his musical style for the first demo cassette he sent to Sublime Records in 1996. According to Harakami, this cassette contained 1/3 of his first album, Unrest. In an interview, he states, Mr. Manabu Yamazaki of Sublime told me that he wanted to release it, and I was overjoyed. A few months later, Mr. Yamazaki, whom I had only spoken to by phone, asked me if I wanted to try a remix. So I gave it a shot, and somehow it got released. So that's how the remix ended up being my public debut. The remix he's referring to here is a remix of a Ken Ishii song, after which Harakami went on to remix a number of other works by Ishii. In 1997, another remix came out, this time of the musical group Kyoki on their album Audio Check. After this, a number of songs were released on various collection CDs including multiple artists, which were later released nearly unchanged on Harakami's first self-titled EP, and even later his first studio album Unrest, which came out on March 5th, 1998. One song that seems to be slightly altered is Vice Versa, which had previously been released as what seems like a demo version under the name Vice Versa on Deviant Records' Pacific State compilation album. In the aforementioned Rising Sun Rock Festival interview, dated August 2nd, 2008, he reflects back on the making of this first album. 10 years ago, I was concentrating on making music, and I wasn't really thinking about how to perform live. One album finally came out, and I was surprised that it was actually selling well. Via the Wayback Machine, I was able to access Rei Harakami's old and currently offline website, where he wrote about his feelings towards his thus far released albums. The site is only available in Japanese, which I don't speak, so these may not be 100% accurate, since I only had limited resources to get a translation. But since these statements were made in retrospect, looking back on his past albums, I think they can form an important piece in understanding Rei's own perspective on his music. About Unrest, Harakami said, "Making this album was a lot of hard work, and I realized how difficult it is to make an album, which luckily did not mean this was to be his last album, as later in the year he already released his November EP, which included songs later to appear on his second studio album Opaque on February 24th, 1999. I will be pronouncing this album name as Opaque for the sake of this video, as I don't really know how else it would be pronounced." About Opaque, Harakami said on his website that he originally planned to release a single with 2 remixed songs, but he thought he'd like to include more songs on the same CD. Somehow, it ended up being more like an album. In the year 2000, an EP was released under the name Blind Swap, which included 2 songs later to be released on the 3rd album Red Curb, but also 2 songs that were only released that once. The same year, Harakami also contributed a song called Pone to the Boogie Pop Phantom OST, sharing this album with notable artists such as Ken Ishii and Status Per Record, which might be more exciting for me since I'm personally a big Status Per Record fan and plan to make another video about them. Red Curb was then released on April 25th of 2001, likely together with the compilation album Trace of Red Curb, which is essentially a remix album of Red Curb, and an EP titled Red Curb Again, which has 2 more songs. Red Curb Again's release date on Discogs is marked as April 25th of 2001, which is where my assumption that all 3 were released together stems from. However, this is more speculation, as I can't really claim Discogs as the most trustworthy source. On Red Curb, Harakami wrote on his website, "When I was making my third album, I was thinking I'm going to do only what I like. By the way, I was thinking of retiring after releasing this album, but that didn't happen." Trace of Red Curb has a more cryptic message, at least in its poorly translated English form. In short, it's a remix album for Red Curb, and while I was thinking that all I needed to know was the outline of the song, I was also wondering if it would be like memories gradually transforming. I think the main idea here is that the remix of a song, in particular the remixes on this album, keep the overall structure and outline of the original to the point that they are recognizable, but are still different, as if the exact memory of it has faded. This is my interpretation at least. This is at least a little bit backed up by the following quote from Harakami in a 2005 interview. "What I always keep in mind when remixing a song is to make it sound like a completely different song while keeping the main melody/meaning intact. In other words, if you look at a certain object from a different point of view/place, it will sound completely different. In this sense, I was aware from the beginning that I was rearranging the music. Many of the remixes that are out there are just trying to make the original track function as a dance track, and I certainly felt like this was mediocre." After another release of a song on a collaboration album that would later appear in its proper Harakami album, the next album, Lust, was released on May 25th of 2005, by many seen as his magnum opus. As Masaaki Hara, a music journalist and label producer who was also a close friend of Rei Harakami, puts it, "It was sonically more expansive than his first records, and the detail of each of the tones came through clearly, combined with a more dynamic and free rhythmic approach." If we look at what Harakami has to say about it himself on his website, it makes sense that this album feels somehow more free and true to the artist. "Up until now, I've always been making songs by myself, but after Red Curb was released, I have been busy remixing and producing for various people, so I decided that I had to make a solo album by myself, and it has been 4 years." It's important to know that around 2003, the formation of the musical duo Yanokami would be in motion, which consisted of Rei Harakami and Akiko Yano. Their first album was not released until 2007, but the pair was already working and performing together in 2004. This is likely a large part of what Harakami is referring to here. In an interview, he also states, "Until the release of Red Curb, I was working on my own work at a leisurely pace, while doing music work that did not involve my name, so in a sense, I think I was able to strike a reasonable balance. However, after the release of Red Curb, I only received offers for work that would put my name to it, remixes, production, etc. And I think the reason for this is that my responsibilities have slowed down my music-making process. However, if I were to ask if I could have made an album like this 2 or 3 years ago, I still don't think I would have been able to." The time taken to make Lust is by far the longest pause in his entire discography, but anyone listening can tell this is what it took to find his sound again after spending a lot of time on remixes and collaborations. In a previously mentioned interview dating back to May 1st, 2006, he states that he doesn't think anything better than Lust will be created anytime soon, and that he would appreciate it if you could wait without any expectations. The next release came quickly in comparison to the long pause of 4 years. Within the same year, the Joy for Joy EP was put out. This included 3 songs, one of which would later reappear on the last new album Harakami would make, Wasuremono, which was released on May 10th of 2006. I call it a new album, but really it was made up of older songs, as Harakami puts it in the same 2006 interview. For this album, I've collected tracks that I felt were somehow unbalanced to include on the albums I've released so far, and I wanted to put them all together properly at some point. He echoes this sentiment on his website, stating that he felt like this would be a nice break from his past works. He mentions that the working title for the album was jokingly said to be Ultra Super Outtakes, but it ultimately got changed to Wasuremono, roughly translating to something forgotten or lost. This is the first Japanese, and stronger even, hiragana album title, as well as all songs on it also being in hiragana. On this, Harakami said in the interview, "I think there are many nuances that can only be conveyed in one's native language. In the end, conveying the meaning is a process of replacing them with nuances that are closest to or similar to them. Remarkable about this album is that even if it consists of songs from different eras put together, it does not sound out of place. Even the oldest song on the record, Sayonara, dating back to 1988 when Harakami was just 18 years old, seems to fit right in. I was debating until the end whether or not to include the song. I included it because I didn't think it felt strange at all. When I listened to the songs in this order again, I realized that what I was doing hadn't changed much, reiterates Harakami himself. After this, Harakami's next release on July 12th of 2006 comes in the form of a collaborative album made specifically for a planetarium showcasing a model of the megastar 2 Cosmos, which projects 5 million stars. This planetarium is located in the National Museum of Emerging Sciences and Innovation, or Miraikan, in Odaiba, Tokyo. This album is titled Colors of the Dark. One of the tracks, Yami wa Hikari no Haha, features a poem of the same name originally by Shuntaro Tanikawa, read by Akiko Harada, which is also a musician and producer known for working with artists such as Fishmans and Azachan and Junrei, the last of which will pop up again on Harakami's radar. The Colors of the Dark album was first limited to 3,000 copies and came with an additional 7-inch vinyl-sized photo book. There have been reprints of this record, but it remains a lesser widely spread album of Harakami's. About it, he said on his website, "I made it with the idea of sustaining the air for 30 minutes so that you may fall asleep. I think the essential message of this sentiment comes across quite clearly. As reflected by the music, this is an ambient work meant to blend in with a planetarium installation and soothe one's senses to the point where you could fall asleep to it." Over the course of the rest of 2006 and 2007, Harakami released an EP titled Evaporator, which features 4 songs, one of which is credited to be composed and arranged by respected Japanese producer Suzuki Ski. Interestingly, Suzuki Ski is also credited as the photographer for the Lost album cover and the composer for track 6 on Wasuremono, Kieta Koi, as well. On a 2022 reissue of Suzuki Ski's own album Thought from 1993, 2 sets of liner notes are attributed to Rei Harakami and Masaaki Hara. A music video for Owari no Kisetsu off of Wasuremono was also directed by Suzuki Ski. In 2009, the pair also started selling what looks like a hand-printed compilation CD with songs from both artists as well as other artists. So although the pair's collaborations aren't as easily identifiable, it's safe to say the two were closely connected. The next project Harakami worked on was a soundtrack for a movie called Tenen Kokeko, or A Gentle Breeze in the Village, released on August 4th, for which he ended up winning the prize for Best Music Score at the 2008 Mainichi Film Awards. On his website, Harakami states, "I tried not to interfere with the film as much as possible. That's all I could think about. I made this 30-minute piece in 1 month, but it is a very intense 30 minutes for me personally." Later that year, the 20th of October, the soundtrack for the movie Appleseed Ex Machina was released, which featured a song by Harakami titled Test Tube. He shares this OST with remarkable Japanese artists like Haruomi Hosono and Cornelius. After this follows a break from releasing solo music, instead focusing on his duo project, Yanokami with Akiko Yano. Their first self-titled studio album was released on August 8th of 2007, followed closely by an EP of live recordings from Tokyo at the start of September. March 12th of 2008 brings the English version of this album titled Yanokami, which closes the first chapter of Yanokami's musical journey. On his website, Harakami says, "The album is filled with the joys and pains of making music. The songs on the Japanese and English versions are slightly different. It's bittersweet to look back on the passion he had for this project now, knowing the next Yanokami release will be posthumously." After this initial start of Yanokami's discography, there is another period of silence from Harakami. Although he's still performing live, it will take a year before his next release. In the aforementioned 2008 interview, Harakami states, "I'm pretty tired. It was the most difficult time. Last year I focused on Yanokami and didn't do any solos, but up until the end of last year I was the most active I had ever been in my life." The next release comes in the form of a 2-part remix album, titled Asage and Yuge respectively, on March 19th of 2009. These albums include exactly what they are titled after, remixes and rearrangements of songs, some previously released on collaborative albums, some entirely new. Not all songs are Harakami songs, but all of them are Harakami mixes. Some notable artists on the album are Uzan, who will continue to collaborate with Harakami, Asa-chan and Junrei, and Chocolate. These are also the first albums released under a label different from Sublime Records, namely Music Mine Inc. The last release this year was not an original Harakami song, but rather a remix/rearrangement of the song Do Re Mi Katamari Do on the Katamari Damacy tribute OST. The last of Harakami's releases during his lifetime are two collaborations with tabla player Uzan, an album titled The World of Kawagoe Rendezvous and a single called Mr. Morning Night, both released in 2010. Harakami mentions on his website that this song was recorded live in one shot in July 2010. For some reason, Harakami is playing the guitar and singing along. Uzan is strumming a silly rhythm on the tabla. Uzan, who is also a former member of the group Asa-chan and Junrei, has collaborated with various Japanese artists such as Ichiko Aoba, Cornelius, and Ryuichi Sakamoto, whom we will bring up later again. After this release, a new yanokami album was supposed to be released soon and was already in the recording phase when tragically Rei Harakami passed away. Their second album, Tokyo wa Chikai, was released in December of 2011, using what recordings Harakami had completed. I want to stand still and reflect a little bit more on yanokami, the duo Harakami formed with Akiko Yano, since I feel like it is an important part of his discography and legacy as an artist. The two met for the first time briefly in 2002 at Rising Sun Rock Festival in Hokkaido, where they were both performing. In 2003, Yano discovered Harakami's work via the band Q-Release song Bara no Hana, remixed by Rei Harakami, and approached him about working together. She reportedly fell in love with his style from the very first musical note. In her own words, I was completely blown away by his performance. I thought I had found a genius. I ended up getting his phone number and asked if he wanted to make music together. He was stunned and accepted my offer. We ended up becoming close friends and made some lovely music together. Akiko Yano even went on to personally identify Harakami's music as world heritage. Meanwhile, Harakami had also been a fan of Yano's work for a long time and was happy to collaborate with her. Early in the winter of 2003, their first collaboration started with Rei working on some of the songs for Akiko, and Akiko performing with Rei's compilation at her annual winter concert, titled Sato Gaeru Concert. The two then began performing together in 2004, and debuted formally as yanokami in 2007 with a self-titled album. From here on out, they concentrated mainly on live performances from 2008 to 2010, playing at both small venues and large festivals. As discussed previously, yanokami's self-titled album came out in 2007, which peaked at number 24 on the Oricon album chart. During the making of the second album, the pair became even more harmonized, and Yano commented on the sound of the album that she wanted to make yanokami more pop. Remarkably, songs from this album were performed live even before their official release. After Harakami's death, scheduled performances went on as planned with guest artists including Uzan, Yoshinori Sunahara, and Maki Morishita. And as mentioned, an album was even released, but ultimately the project did not last much longer. Harakami's often unconventional way of making music led to an exploration of a whole new sound. Not only did he use limited instruments, he used them in inventive ways by, for example, playing the samples of the CS88 Pro in reverse. Despite being recognizably Harakami, his sound did shift throughout his years as a musician. Compared to his later records, the sonic detailing of Unrest resembles techno. But the album already hinted at the deep delays and reverbs, extreme panning, and smooth pitch bending techniques that became the trademark of his sound later on. On Opaque, diverse tones and rhythmic patterns stand out, alongside the more extreme uses of sound processing. Lust is the first album to include vocals, namely in his cover of Haruomi Hosono's Owari no Kisetsu, which is actually the demo version of the cover released together with Akiko Yano on yanokami's debut album. Towards the end of his life, Harakami's live shows were based on ambient soundscapes that were devoid of beats, which makes sense considering his near-last release, Colors of the Dark, is one of the most ambient sounds among his discography. When being asked in 2008 about what things had changed over the past decade, he answered that the live equipment has changed, but the equipment used to create the sound has remained largely the same. Also, me. The sound source hasn't changed much. I think in about 10 years, we'll realize how amazing it is that the sound source hasn't changed. This is yet another saddening quote, since we will never see the speculated, promising future he had in mind. Harakami talks about his minimal setup in an interview. The secret is that I didn't have any money to begin with. It sounds nice to call it a studio, but it's just my room with my equipment. As for equipment, it is not the case that only expensive equipment that can do various things can produce quality products, nor is it the case that new technology will always produce new expression. Even with the Roland sound modules that I continue to use, I believe that a variety of things can be done depending on the combination. It is not hard to imagine that a company that has to generate money by constantly developing and selling new software and hardware would not be very happy with my way of doing things. At the time of the release of Harakami's debut album Unrest in 1998, a new wave of electronic musicians were surfacing and rapidly changing the local musical landscape. Up until then in Japan, electronic music was largely geared towards clubs, but just as the West was experiencing an uprising of ambient electro artists, Japan was too. As Masaaki Hara puts it, this Japanese IDM movement brought forth delicate and subtle electronic records with a distinctive Japanese sound that were in contrast to the world of electronic music that was dominated by acid house and Detroit techno. In this climate, creative minds thrived and produced timeless staple albums. Ken Ishii, whose name has been mentioned a few times, most likely had an influence on Harakami's developing style, as he was signed to the same label Harakami would later sign to, Sublime Records. A speculated trait Ishii might have influenced Harakami on is the recognizable panning sound in his music. In a 2004 interview with Ken Ishii, he explains that, while in Europe there was a techno scene earlier, we did not experience any of that. We were more influenced by YMO and some other bands around them, so maybe that's the main reason why we were not typical dance DJ artists. In the same interview, the interviewer states that they always felt that those early Sublime releases by Yu, Rei Harakami, and the others, while obviously influenced by Western music, still had a very specific sound that set them apart from Western artists that were doing similar music around that time. And even though those Sublime acts differed a lot from each other in style, they still had that common sound. And I actually first heard YMO a few years later, and after listening to their later releases, I felt that that's it. It is the missing link between Western techno and the early Sublime sound. To which Ishii responds, I guess so, especially our generation, we were all influenced by them. They were really huge in Japan and had a big impact both musically and culturally. This brings us smoothly to another notable influence for Harakami and Japanese IDM in general. Haruomi Hosono. Hosono made solo music, but is also widely known as the starter of Yellow Magic Orchestra, from here on referred to as YMO, together with Ryuichi Sakamoto and Yukihiro Takahashi. Starting a music career in the late 1960s, he's considered to be one of Japan's most influential musicians, helping develop far more than just the electro genre. Besides solo and collaborative music, he also produced movie soundtracks, namely Ghibli's Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, and more recently Hirokazu Koreeda's Shoplifters. A fun connection here is that Sakamoto, Hosono's co-founder of YMO and ex-husband to Akiko Yano, also produced a soundtrack for one of Koreeda's movies, Monster. As stated in a recent article exploring his legacy, Hosono's relentless work ethic and obsession with creating new sounds blended perfectly with his deep-seated interest in advancing technology, especially starting in the 1980s. For Hosono, the possibilities of production became boundless due to the rise of synthesizers and samplers, which propelled him into his most explorative and curious period. When comparing this to the technological climate Harakami found himself in during the start of his career, it's easy to see the parallels between their exploration of new emerging technological possibilities in music. Indirectly, Harakami is more closely tied to YMO than just musical influence. As mentioned before, Akiko Yano, his partner in the yanokami project, was married for a while to Ryuichi Sakamoto, and has recorded and performed music with YMO since as far back as the 1980s, and even with the members of the band before it had been created. She collaborated with Hosono specifically in Tin Pan Alley, formerly known as Caramel Mama, a quartet active in the 70s including Hosono on the bass, for their reunion tour in 2014 to 2015. She also covered Hosono and YMO songs on multiple occasions. In 2007, Yanokami's cover song Love is Peach Color was included on the collaborative album Tribute to Haruomi Hosono, which coincidentally also features Akiko Hara, who had been Harakami's partner in the Colors of the Dark project only a year before. Harakami was likely influenced by a lot more artists of the time, with whom he sometimes also collaborated. For example, Nobukazu Takemura, for whom Harakami remixed tracks, as well as just generally being a friend. Other pioneers in Japanese 80s and 90s IDM such as Hiroshi Yoshimura and Susumu Yokota, who released a few albums on Sublime Records during the time Harakami was starting out in his career, are relatively safe to be assumed direct or indirect sources of inspiration for him. In 2006, Rei himself gave a few inspirations for his work, mentioning Scritti Politi's White Bread Black Beer, Kenji Ozawa's Ecology of Everyday Life, Herbert's Secondhand Sounds, and Brian Eno's Opal series. He also once gave this lengthy and confusing list of names in a 2005 interview. It's apparent that he didn't limit himself to Japan, and instead took inspiration from global IDM and electro musicians. But as Mark Frosty McNeil, DJ and colleague of Masaaki Hara at Dublab internet radio station, states, "More so than the influence of other people, when I listen to Harakami's work, I get the sense that he was captivated by the magic of our world, the fleeting wonders that are only recognized by the eyes of the perceiver, and thereby cherished as intangible elements that when summed make us human." It's important to remember that though Harakami's work may have been influenced by important artists in his genre, his music is still a unique and innovative body of work that stands separate from its predecessors. Harakami's legacy outside of his own discography is extensive, mainly due to a lot of remixes he did for other artists. For example, one of my favorites, he remixed Ude by Japanese post-hardcore band Number Girl, released in 2003, with the remix being released in 2005. Besides the extensive list of collaborations, Harakami has had an impact of his own on artists who came after him. DJ and electronic producer Takahide Higuchi states, "The recording and music production technology continues to develop, and I feel very positive about that. Because of that, to me, Harakami's pursuit of focusing on a piece of old equipment resembles a dialogue between a human and his machine." Once again, the unique approach to making music is an element that sets Harakami's music apart, and that influences people's perspective on what equipment is needed to create something timeless. Japanese musician Tom GGG confirms this by saying that via Harakami's music he learned that machines are not crucial factors in making music, because he composed brand new electronic music with an old school machine called SC88 Pro. Even today, almost 15 years after his death, and at least 25 years since his debut as a musician, Harakami's music does not sound dated, and in fact still sparks inspiration. Popular Japanese musician Wednesday Campanella reports listening to Red Curb a lot in high school, which later influenced her music, as well as game soundtrack producer Sean, or Melos Hantani, stating he recently decided to emulate some of his style for an Anodyne 2 piece, specifically referring to the album Lust. Western artists are no exception for this, as Atlanta, Georgia-based artist Thomas Howard, better known as Orchid Mantis, refers to Rei Harakami as a big influence for teaching me what my personal ideal is for ambient electronica, and for making Owari no Kisetsu, probably my favorite song ever recorded. Canadian musician Laced also cites Harakami, whose music she admires for its ability to be at once deeply evocative and also playful and frivolous, as one of her biggest inspirations. It makes sense that Harakami's reach is as much within Japan as outside it, with a lot of people saying they were influenced by him also mentioning Western artists like Aphex Twin, Brian Eno, Boards of Canada, and Square Pusher, since Harakami himself was likely influenced by these Western artists also. He stated himself in 2008 that when I've never been to a place, I always wonder, are there really people listening to me? So I'm always relieved that there are people who are listening to me. For now, this concludes my deep dive into Rei Harakami's life and legacy. Many people today still love and listen to his music, and many miss Harakami deeply. Under any given song of his, comments in various languages will express their admiration and the solace they find in his music. To many people, Harakami's music speaks to a deeper part of the soul, and while it is sad that he had to leave this earth so soon, it is comforting to know his music lives on in so many people, connecting them. He was truly a pioneer in Japan's, and by extension the world's, musical development, and stands out even today. Although I personally found out about his music way after he passed, it holds a special place in my heart, which is why I've decided to put time and effort into researching and sharing my findings on Harakami as an artist. However, it's evident that my resources are limited, so by all means, if you have any additional facts or knowledge, share it with me. With that, I'll end the video, and thank you so much if you watched this all the way through. I don't really know what I'm doing.